We live in a fallen world. The true state of human civilization should be to live communally as one, but instead we are alienated individuals, constantly competing one against the other for our own egotistical advantage. How could we live in a better world? Well, the answer must be through glorious revolution to work our way back to the communist utopia. This is the central ideology of Marxism, the ideology of Karl Marx, which I have seen expressed in many places, many works of political philosophy and works of art and storytelling. But the one place I didn't expect to find Marxist ideology was in a streaming television show from the uber-capitalist Disney Corporation.
To steal from the Empire?
Andor, a Star Wars story, has proven to be something of a slow burn mega hit over the last few months, as audiences who were burned out from one attempt to exploit the Star Wars franchise as streaming television shows for the Disney Plus platform after another slowly came back to what has proven to be by far the best produced and best written of all of Disney's attempts to make Star Wars for contemporary audiences. The surprising thing about the new fandom for Andor, perhaps, are those people who have condemned Disney's attempts to exploit the Star Wars franchise as woke garbage. Because Andor is by far the most woke Star Wars television show so far, and arguably the most woke Star Wars television show that it would be possible to make, because it is, quite literally, a Marxist allegory.
So fat and satisfied.
For the people saying, oh, I don't see anything woke about Andor, I really like that show and I hate wokeness, we're going to go through step by step in an analysis how Andor illustrates Marxist ideology. Warning, this is not a moral or ethical evaluation of the ideological structures of Marxism. This is a critical assessment of Marxist messaging in Andor, a Star Wars story. But at the conclusion of this assessment, we will investigate why haters of Marxism may find meaning or even pleasure in Andor, a Star Wars story. But before we get there, I have to explain to you why I hate Bertolt Brecht.
East Berlin, the final resting place of Bertolt Brecht, essayist, poet, and playwright. His theory of the epic theater was to revolutionize dramatic practice in our century.
I'm one of those people who, perhaps foolishly, has dedicated my entire professional life and my studies to the understanding of storytelling in all of its forms. And when I was in sixth form, which I believe is high school to the American viewers out there, I was particularly interested in studying theatre. And I was made to study the works of interwar German playwright Bertolt Brecht, which I really disliked at the time for two reasons. The more important of those reasons was that Bertolt Brecht is, or was, a Marxist. And I really objected to the Marxist ideas because at the time I didn't understand how they applied to me at all. I also disliked Bertolt Brecht because of his idea of Verfremdungseffekt, which translates roughly as the alienation effect, which he sought in his work. As a Marxist playwright, Brecht was trying to awaken people to the realities of social injustice through his plays like The Caucasian Chalk Circle or The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui. And Brecht developed a set of principles for doing this that he called epic theatre, or later dialectical theatre. And Verfremdungseffekt, which I struggled to pronounce just then and couldn't pronounce at all as a teenager, which is the reason I disliked Bertolt Brecht, was one of the ways of doing this, to alienate the audience from being immersed in the story by doing things like stopping the drama and having characters make epic political speeches.
There is a darkness reaching like rust into everything around us. The empire is a disease that thrives in darkness. It is never more alive than when we sleep.
Or sowing extracts from political manifestos through the drama.
There will be times when the struggle seems impossible. Remember this. Freedom is a pure idea. Random acts of insurrection are occurring constantly throughout the galaxy. Remember that the frontier of the rebellion is everywhere. And even the smallest act of insurrection pushes our lines forward.
And I would suggest to you that Tony Gilroy and the team behind Andor, A Star Wars Story, are using the effects of Verfremdungseffekt to achieve epic theatre in the epic storytelling of Star Wars Andor. Tony Gilroy is a major Hollywood movie director, even more so now with the success of Andor. And he has in interviews said that he didn't intend for Andor to be political. He's also said that one of the major characters in Andor was based on the historical actions of Joseph Stalin. This is a bit like saying you come in peace whilst packing an AR-15. So let us together follow the journey of Cassian Andor from his childhood to his awakening to the truths of class consciousness and social injustice. A journey that he begins among the native tribespeople of the planet Kenari, who in Marxist ideology represent the primitive. This word isn't used pejoratively by Marxists. It's used rather to suggest something more like the primary, that the basic state of humanity is to live in peace, in cooperation, in community, together as one. Then the young Cassian's life is destroyed by the arrival of industry, capitalism, the processes of material production that will destroy the primary model of human life and instead transform us into a capitalist society, which in Star Wars Andor arrives in the form of an imperial mining disaster which disturbs the peace of the world of Kenari, where we can see that the empire that arises in Andor isn't much different from the republic that came before it. They are both essentially capitalist in structure, but one has done the inevitable thing, which in Marxist theory, capitalism will always do. Because capitalism is an artificial construct, enforcing itself upon the more natural communist forms of human life, it must be enforced with increasing levels of violence, intimidation, political oppression. And this is wielded most commonly in capitalist society, not through military force, which is too disruptive, but through intelligence services, which in Star Wars Andor are represented by the Imperial Security Bureau, the ISB, all of the members of which are, of course, well-spoken, British colonialists. And the model for capitalist imperialist colonialism throughout Andor and much of the Star Wars franchise is the model that was enforced on much of the world by the British Empire through the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. The young Cassian is rescued by Marva and Clem Andor, from which he gets the name Cassian Andor, which represents the two parts of the human that has been sucked into the fallen capitalist power structure, the true human, who is Cassian, and the alienated adult, who is Andor. And what we follow in Andor, A Star Wars Story, is the journey of the alienated adult human being. It's symbolically significant that Andor is searching for his lost sister. In psychoanalytic interpretations of Marxist ideology, from figures like Sigmund Freud, that search for a pure other, a pure self, often of opposite gender. For a man, it would be a perfect idealized female, like a missing sister, is symbolic of the search for the self that we have lost as we are alienated in capitalist society. Cassian Andor then grows up in the proletariat mass, the people of Ferrix, which is a hyper-capitalist planet world entirely concerned with various forms of production that the proletariat perform, but they don't profit from. They make everything from bricks to starships, and Ferrix is a massive trading center for all of the various capitalist goods produced around the galaxy. But the profits are all extracted away from the proletariat. Ultimately, the capitalist power systems will seek to take away everything from the proletariat in their growing quest to exert more power and control over the systems of production. Those means of production are owned by the bourgeoisie, the small minority of society who receive all of the excess wealth from their ownership of the means of production. We see the bourgeoisie in Andor in two forms. One is the world of Coruscant and the character of Mon Mothma and the family and colleagues around her, who are all the most powerful top tier of the bourgeoisie. Mon Mothma has been born into great wealth, but she doesn't get to control that wealth. And this is quite pivotal, that whilst the bourgeoisie may be individually powerful to an extent, they are embedded as much as anyone else within systems of power. And it's the growing awareness of their own powerlessness that leads the bourgeoisie to forms of rebellion and revolution. The second form in Andor, A Star Wars Story is the petty bourgeoisie, who are of much lower rank and little to no influence, but who have some kind of salaried position in the power structures of capitalist society. Much like Cyril Khan, who begins as a police inspector and then loses that position, but is constantly struggling to regain some form of position in society. And the petty bourgeoisie are kept in place by this struggle to become members of the true elite, the higher levels of the bourgeoisie. That awareness of their individual powerlessness in the face of the structural injustices within their society leads a small number of the bourgeoisie to become bourgeois revolutionaries. Within Marxist theory, it's commonly believed that the revolution must be led by members of the privileged elite because they are the only individuals who have the freedom of action to actually begin to disrupt the capitalist power structures at great cost, because the bourgeois revolutionary is generally believed to be acting selfishly for their own egotistical interests. And so they are seen by the revolution not just as expendable, but they will probably have to be sacrificed. So they won't be allowed to join the final communist utopia. While the true leaders of the revolution, the rebel alliance, you may wish to call it, are the Leninist Vanguard. Lenin was the first true communist or Marxist world leader who practiced a very particular form of Marxism called Leninism, which was distinguished by its belief that it must be led by its own elite, an intellectual vanguard who had the unique levels of education and personal insight to both incite and lead the revolution. This vanguard are represented in Andor by Lumpen, because whilst Lumpen practices a Leninist vanguardism, he is also a Stalinist accelerationist. Stalin's contribution to Marxist theory was the idea that you would have to accelerate the evils of capitalism through acts of criminality or terrorism or the incitement of wars or other form of violence to accelerate capitalism to its peak of violence, in fact, to the pinnacle of fascism, so that the people would rise up against it, which is exactly Lumpen's strategy in Andor. This Stalinist accelerationism leads most forms of Marxism to an embrace of criminal enterprise. Within Marxist ideology, the underclass of society are seen to be forced into criminality. Therefore, the Marxist is willing to embrace both criminals, because they're seen as representatives of the proletariat, and acts of criminality. So the robbery, the heist, which is the central caper at the heart of Andor Star Wars story, is based on a set of historical events like the 1907 Tiflis bank robbery, which was conducted by senior members of the Russian Communist Party, including Lenin and Stalin and many others. You can ignore politics, but politics will not ignore you. A famous quotation from the Greek statesman Pericles, often quoted by the Marxist leader of the Communist Party of China, Mao Zedong. In Marxist ideology, individuals who choose not to participate in the revolution are equally implicated within the power structures and social injustices of capitalism. This is the situation that Cassian Andor finds himself in. He has rejected his call to participation in the revolution. He is deliberately remaining ignorant of the truths of social injustice and the reality of class consciousness. And he chooses instead to escape. This is the common act of individuals who have semi-awakened to the injustices of society, you can no longer participate in the proletariat. So instead, you choose to escape, to make some money any way you can and go and live on a beach, a pleasure island somewhere. And this typically leads the alienated individual like Cassian Andor to fall into the Lumpen proletariat, because the easiest way to make those sums of money once you're alienated from the proletariat is acts of criminality. The Lumpen proletariat are the very bottom layer, the underclass of a society, often considered to be criminal in their activities: thieves, prostitutes, gangsters, drug dealers, many other forms of individual who are unable to participate fully in the productive proletariat. And there is a debate within Marxism about whether the Lumpen proletariat can be made part of the revolution. Capitalism, however, knows how to make use of the Lumpen proletariat. The postmodern and Marxist philosopher Michel Foucault outlined this in his 1975 book, Discipline and Punishment, The Birth of the Prison, where he shows that the prison system is in fact not so much about punishing or controlling criminality as it is about taking the Lumpen proletariat and through torture, discipline, punishment, and imprisonment, making them an effective workforce. Exactly what we see on Narkina 5, the ultimate disciplinarian prison with a system of punishment that compels the Lumpen proletariat individuals imprisoned there to continual productivity. But if the Lumpen proletariat can rise up against the systems of punishment and imprisonment within which they are trapped.
You play against all the other tables in this room. I play against all the other rooms.
Please. I absolutely adore Andy Serkis's performance as the everyman who believes the story he has been given, that he will one day be released from his continual punishment and allowed to pursue productivity for his own profit instead of for the capitalist system and the profits of the bourgeoisie, and his awakening to the fact that he will never be released and must instead join the revolutionary spirit. Marxist ideology believes that the revolution does not arise from any single individual. Instead, it comes from the revolutionary spirit, the accumulation of acts of oppression by the capitalist system upon the individual, who then rise up to reform their communal living structures. And what do we have at the climax of Andor but the literal spirit of the proletariat calling them to participate in the revolution? Never has a clearer symbol of Marxist ideology been put on screen by the Disney Corporation. So why do so many of the usual suspects who are perpetually angered by woke ideology somehow enjoy the Marxist allegory of Andor, a Star Wars story following a protagonist of color from a native peoples on his journey of personal awakening to the systematic social injustices of society and to his own class consciousness? I think it's because there's a deep truth in the story, our human society is systematically unjust to many, many of its members. And there are, I think, 3 responses to the understanding of that injustice. One of them is the response of the original Star Wars movies, which is the mythic or the fantasy response, which is that I will become a hero and I will rescue Princess Leia and I will destroy the Death Star, the ultimate symbol of oppressive power in the galaxy. But this is a response that can only really be believed by children. The adult understanding of that same response is what we see in Andor's Star Wars story, which is that, yes, you and many other thousands, millions of individuals will make personal acts of rebellion against oppressive power that will be at great cost. You will have your own awakening, but you may become lost in nihilistic escapism along the way. You may fall into the Lumpen Proliteriat. This is the adult story. This is the true cost of fighting against oppressive power. But there is a third response, and this is the response of the fascists, a response that we see growing again in our society today as the inequalities and the structural injustices grow, which is the response that I see now that there are injustices in our society, so my group must win. And this ultimately leads those people who make that choice on the path through authoritarianism to totalitarianism and then to true fascism. I hope you choose not to make that third response. I hope we recognize that we can't make the first response, the childish fantasy response, and that we are all invested with the complex decisions to resist oppression wherever we find it. That doesn't mean we're all going to become Marxists. Marxism is a 150-year-old critique of the oppressive power structures of society. It doesn't mean we're all going to reject capitalism. That is a critique that lacks the true complexity that we need today. What it means is that we must all recognize the personal costs that will be inescapable if we are to maintain our freedoms. There's so much more to be said about this. Here on the Science Fiction YouTube channel, we make the pop critiques. So if you want to go deeper into this understanding of science fiction and fantasy storytelling, hop over to damiengwalter.com/podcast and subscribe to the Science Fiction Podcast, currently on season break, but we go deep 1 or 2 hour critiques of sci-fi and fantasy storytelling, of their political relevance to our contemporary civilization and society. Please do subscribe. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.